You know that specific moment in a store or a listing or a cart when something catches your attention not because you need it for the life you are living, but because you need it for the life you are imagining. The running shoes for the person who is going to start running. The cookbook for the person who is going to cook more. The guitar for the person who is finally going to learn. The wardrobe for the body that is going to be different by the time the season changes. And you think about your answer to that moment, which is a question, not a purchase. Do I actually do this? Not intend to do this. Not plan to do this. Not wish I did this. But actually, currently, as the person I am today, do this. And if the answer is no, the cart is empty. Not because the aspiration is wrong, because the object was never going to close the distance between who you are and who you meant to become. Here is what almost nobody calculates about buying for who they intend to become. The purchase is never just the purchase. When someone buys something for a version of themselves that does not yet exist, the runner they are about to become, the cook they have always wanted to be, the reader who finally has the time, something happens that would not happen if they had waited to see whether the version arrived. The purchase feels like progress. It feels like the first step of a real transition, concrete, visible, paid for, proof that the intention is serious in a way that intention alone never quite manages to be. And then the shoes go into the cupboard, and the cookbook goes onto the shelf, and the guitar goes into the corner where it stays, precisely as expensive as it was the day it arrived, serving no function except to remind the room of a version of its owner that never quite showed up. The object did not fail. It was never the problem. The problem was that the purchase was asked to do something that purchases cannot do, to close the distance between an intention and the life by making the intention tangible before the life had caught up. Nobody adds up the total of everything bought for the person they were going to become. The equipment, the clothes, the books, the tools for the hobby that lasted 3 weeks. It arrives in individual purchases, each one reasonable, each one hopeful, each one quietly added to the inventory of things that serve a version of the owner that is no longer expected to arrive. There is a name for why buying something feels so much like becoming something. Researchers call it identity-based consumption. Russell Belk, whose work on the extended self became foundational in consumer psychology, documented in 1988 that people use their possessions to construct, extend, and communicate identity. What we own is not just what we use. It is a statement about who we are and, more dangerously for the budget, who we intend to be. The running shoes do not just protect the feet. They declare the runner, and in many cases, the declaration is all there ever is. The specific mechanism is the intention-action gap, the distance between deciding to change and actually changing. Buying the object closes part of that gap. Without closing the gap itself, the purchase feels like a first step, reduces the urgency of the actual change. The runner who bought the shoes feels more like a runner before running a single mile than they did before the purchase. The identity has been acquired. The behavior has not. Never buying for the person they might become is not a refusal of aspiration. It is the recognition that the object cannot do the work of the change. Paying for it before the change arrives is paying for a declaration that the life has not yet confirmed. And identity-based consumption found an entire industry designed to serve it. For years, the language of marketing has pointed not at who the customer is, but at who the customer could become. Invest in yourself. Dress for the job you want. Buy the life you are working toward. These phrases sell the aspirational self as though the product were the path, as though the shoes made the runner. Never buying for the person they might become is not refusing to grow. It is the insistence that the purchase follow the change, the equipment arriving after the runner has already shown up. And the numbers confirm what the empty cupboard already knew. A 2019 CNBC report estimated that the average American spends around $18,000 per year on impulse purchases, many of them aspirational, bought for a version of the buyer the purchase was supposed to create. The equipment arrives, the version does not. The money is gone either way. 3 forces. A mind that uses purchases to close the gap between intention and identity, without closing the gap in behavior. A marketing culture that sells the aspirational self as the product. And an inventory of objects that belong to versions of their owner that never arrived. It was there the running shoes, bought with real intention, worn twice, still in the cupboard in their original shape, 3 years later, a monument to a habit that did not form, still looking new enough to resell, which made the truth of it harder to ignore, not easier. It was there the cookbook, the ambitious one, full of recipes for a Saturday that kept getting rescheduled, still on the shelf with the receipt still inside the front cover, looking exactly like a book that belongs to someone who cooks this way, and exactly unlike a book that had been opened more than twice. The spine still stiff, the pages still flat, nothing about it suggesting that a single recipe had ever made it to a stove. It was there the wardrobe audit, going through everything owned and asking, without mercy, which of these things belonged to the person who actually got dressed this morning, and which belonged to the person who was going to have a different life by the time these things were needed. And finding that the 2 categories were further apart than had been comfortable to acknowledge. That an entire section of the closet belonged to someone who had simply never shown up. It was there the camera, the expensive one, bought for the creator they were about to become, used twice in the first month, still sitting on the shelf in its original box, waiting for videos that were never filmed, for a version of its owner who never quite turned up to do the filming. It was there the moment of deciding. Not to buy the thing, the piece of equipment for the hobby not yet started, the book for the subject not yet studied, the clothes for the occasion not yet arrived, and feeling, briefly, the specific discomfort of not having something to show for an intention, and then the specific relief of knowing that the intention was still entirely intact and the money was still entirely present. These are not people without ambition. Most of them have plans, real ones, with timelines, with the specific texture of things that are actually happening rather than things that are being prepared for indefinitely. What they do not have is the habit of buying ahead of the life, of purchasing the equipment for the version of themselves they have not yet become, as though the purchase were the proof that the becoming is underway, as though owning the right kind of gear were a substitute for, rather than a consequence of, actually doing the thing. They are the person who, when they want to start running, runs first, and buys the shoes when the running is already there, when the shoes are needed by someone who already exists, not promised to someone who is still on the way. That is not someone without aspiration. That is someone who learned that the object does not create the habit, and that the money spent on the equipment for the person they had not yet become was money spent on a declaration that the life had not confirmed, made before any evidence existed that it ever would. They do not feel the pull of the aspirational purchase at the moment of wanting to change. That pull was examined, found to be the mind closing a gap the object could not close, and set aside, without drama, in favor of the change itself arriving before the equipment does. Now, finally, the objection. Sometimes you need the equipment to get started. You can't run without shoes. You can't learn without tools. Sometimes buying the thing is what makes the habit real. This is not about refusing to invest in becoming someone different. There are purchases that genuinely support a real transition, a hobby being actively built, a skill being genuinely developed. Nothing here argues against buying what you actually need to do something you are actually doing. This is about the purchase that stands in for the transition, that feels like the beginning of a change that the object itself was never going to produce. And the "you need the tools to start" argument carries considerably less weight than it assumes. Most habits begin before the optimal equipment arrives. People run in whatever shoes they have. They cook with whatever they own. They learn with whatever is available. The tool that is truly needed becomes obvious from the doing, and the person who buys after doing is buying for themselves, not for a version of themselves they are still hoping to meet. The people who never buy for the person they might become are not limiting their own potential. They are simply and patiently still waiting for the actual person to show up before buying them things. Here is what most people get backwards. The person who buys for the person they intend to become, who fills the wardrobe with the life they are working toward, who equips the hobby before the habit has formed, who buys the books for the reader they will be when they finally have more time, is not investing in their future. They are paying for a declaration about their future that the future has not yet endorsed, and that the object, sitting in the cupboard, will quietly contradict every month it stays there unused. Every season it remains exactly where it was placed the day it arrived. The person who never buys for the person they might become is not settling for less. They are buying for someone who actually exists, whose needs are real, whose habits are established, whose life the object will enter and be used. Most people buy for the person they intend to become. These people buy for the person they actually are, today, right now. And the cupboard always quietly tells the entire difference. There is a moment people who never buy for the person they might become all describe in almost the same way. It is not the decision not to buy something. It is not the moment of walking away from the cart. It is an ordinary day of using what they own. The kitchen that contains what they actually cook with. The wardrobe that holds what they actually wear. The shelves with the books they have actually read. And noticing, briefly, that everything in the room belongs to the person in it. Not to a version of them that was supposed to arrive. To the person who is actually there, using things bought for someone who already existed. Not minimalism, not restriction, just the quiet coherence of a life whose objects match the person who owns them, because the objects were chosen for that person, not for the person they were planning to become. Not because aspiration is wrong, because the purchase was never the path to it. The purchase was never the point. What never buying for the person they might become said about everything else was. 10 years from now, nobody asks what you meant to do. They ask what you did, and whether the things you bought were for the person who did it. Do you still buy for who you plan to be? And has any of it actually changed who you are? Drop it below. We read every single one.